Welcome back to Joe Stunner Boxing. One of my pet hates, one of my pet bugbears is when people talk about boxing. They say, "Oh, it was in a terrible place. It's dying. It's on life support." It was definitely going to die before the excellent Turkey came along, and Dana White coming in might be a good thing. It might revitalise boxing. Boxing doesn't need revitalising, and boxing was in no shape or form dying before Turkey El Sheikh came along. This is a myth. It's a myth that's often peddled by people who don't know the difference between something that's dead in the water or dying a slow death and something that is flawed, very flawed in some respects, but nevertheless alive and well. And I think the latter is what boxing was before Turkey came along. And, boxing over the decades has had good times, bad times. It's survived the mob, it's survived 2 world wars, it's survived over the decades. Many, many attempts to make it illegal. And one of the things that people often pick upon is all these different weight classes, all these different belts. This is terrible. It didn't used to be like that in the old days. It just used to be 8 weight classes. And, well, I've got some bad news for you. Some very bad news. If you go back far enough, and I'm talking about the gloved era, not the bare knuckle era, the gloved era, there weren't 8 weight divisions. There weren't even the current 17 weight divisions, or 18 if you include Bridgerweight. There were 42 divisions, 42 weight divisions pre-1909, okay? And the 8 weight divisions were established pretty much under the auspices of what was called the National Sporting Club, which was based in London in Covent Garden. And that was in 1909. Now, the 8 weight divisions, traditional weight divisions, are flyweight, bantamweight, featherweight, lightweight, welterweight, middleweight, light, heavy, heavyweight. So that's 8, okay? Prior to that, like I say, there were over 40, 42, I think it was, weight divisions, and they were separated by a couple of pounds apiece. And in fact, these different weights didn't even necessarily stick to a specific weight. So, for example, for one fight, lightweight might be 134 pounds. Then a defence might be made, but it was the stipulated weight was 128, but it was for a lightweight title. And so the weights were jumping up and down. They were all over the place. And absolutely, it's the Wild West. Absolute chaos. And it took the National Sporting Club really to come along and sort of get the house in order. The National Sporting Club was founded in 1891, and like I say, it was based in Covent Garden, and it was founded by Arthur Billincourt. I'm doing this from memory. Billincourt, I think his name was, and a former ABA lightweight champion called John Fleming. And they had both been members of the precursor to the Sporting Club, which was called the Pelican Club, which was in it was near, I can't remember the exact location, it was near Piccadilly Circus in London. Very sort of London-centric British boxing was. It probably still is. Now, let's get one thing straight. If you go back to the days of the Pelican Club, which I think was founded in 1887, I want to say, and the National Sporting Club was founded in 1891 because it came afterwards. Bedingcourt, whatever his name was, and Fleming were members of the Pelican Club, and they became a bit disillusioned with it, and they left and kind of formed the Sporting Club, which took over. In fact, the Pelican Club closed in 1891, which I think was the same year that the National Sporting Club opened its doors, and they sorted it all out. This is I'm giving you a little sort of thumbnail sketch here. This is quite complicated because we're talking amateur boxing and professional boxing and so on. But both those clubs were pretty much, gentlemen's clubs, gentlemen only. It wasn't like the doors opened, bought a ticket, you went down there, working class, you weren't getting in. But they did have the top boxers, not just in Britain, but internationally, including some of the Americans were lured over to fight British counterparts. There were other venues as well as the Pelican Club. One was called the Aquarium or something club, something like that. I should really have read up on this. I'm doing it from memory. It was called there was there was a big glass structure. I can't remember where it was. I think it was. I'd have to look it up. But there were several clubs that were used in the early days. I'm talking about the 1880s, 1880s. The sort of dawn of the gloved era, if you like John L. Sullivan, that sort of era. But again, it was considered, the gentlemen were the ones that got invited, and it was suit and tie stuff. And in actual fact, in the early days of the Pelican Club, you weren't allowed to make a noise during the round. You weren't allowed to cheer. You weren't allowed to applaud. You weren't allowed to shout. You weren't allowed to do anything. That was reserved for between rounds, and that was because you wanted the guys to just concentrate on what they were doing, which was fighting. So we talk about the Riyadh season supposedly lacking atmosphere, but no, it was sometimes you see these Japanese shows, which I absolutely love. And the Japanese are really quite a very respectful lot, they will applaud politely. But there wasn't a lot of crowd noise, even though the fights might be brilliant. You might get the odd sort of call of encouragement, but the Japanese shows, the Japanese just tend to be very respectful, and it's considered rude to sort of shout and brawl and all that sort of stuff. But this was even worse back in the Pelican Club. You weren't allowed to say anything. But where am I going with this? The Pelican Club closed. The National Sporting Club opened in 1891, and it wasn't until 1909 that everything had been really sorted out. So it took 18 years to really sort everything out into what became the 8 weight divisions. I mean, if you look at some of the books, you take, for example, some of the Nat Fleischer books. Nat Fleischer was the founder of the Ring. No doubt he was a very knowledgeable man when it came to boxing history. But a lot of the records in those books are inaccurate. Having said that, don't get me wrong, I'm not necessarily picking on Fleischer, because if you look at BoxRec, a lot of those records, I'm sure some of those contradict what I've previously read. Talking about the old timers now, they just don't look. That there's a lot of newspaper decisions that aren't mentioned, and disqualifications. There's a lot of disqualifications that I've read about that aren't even listed on early fighters like Elmer Ray and Obi Walker and people like that. I think I've done videos on those guys. There's stuff missing. This is where being a real historian comes in. If you're a real historian, you will research stuff. You will, fact check it, cross reference everything, because you don't rely on one source. You've got to get every single source, try and look for the common denominators, and say, then maybe unearth a new document or two. That's a real historian. Okay, I'm definitely not a historian. I'm just a fan who's read a lot. But the 8 weight divisions were not the original bedrock of boxing, of the gloved era of boxing. There were dozens of so-called weight divisions and so-called champions, and some real pioneers, some great fighters, held all sorts of titles at various points that were contradicted. And then you get into the whole subject of, the colour bar, because a lot of people, it's like I was talking to someone a few days ago about Sam Langford, and they said, he's the best fighter to have never won a world title. Well, if you're going to say that the standard recognised title, in other words, let's call it the white title, was the world title, then okay, he never won that. He was never given the chance to win it. But you can make a very strong case by saying that a lot of those so-called coloured titles were far more legitimate than the, for want of a better phrase, white titles. You know what I mean? So boxing history is very muddy indeed. You have to sift through it, and you have to spend a lot of time reading and, like I say, cross-referencing. But I always have to just rather smugly sort of smirk whenever I hear people say, it was so much better when there were 8 weight divisions. Well, not necessarily, but don't think for a single second that the state we're in today, with all these different weight divisions and all these different belts, is anything new. On the contrary, it goes back 135 years at least. All right. So anyway, just thought I'd make a little video about that subject, something a little bit different. But yeah, you got any thoughts on this? Perhaps you know something I don't. Leave your comments below, and if you like the video, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel as usual. Spread the word about Joe Stunner Boxing. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and bye for now.